Okay, so let's go through how these three tools work. So the first one we talked about was the reserve requirement ratio. Okay. So what the reserve requirement ratio is it's a minimum percentage. So let's actually write that down for you. It's a minimum percentage of deposits that banks must have on hand at the end of the day. Okay. They can have more deposits than are required if they so desire, but they cannot have less. So just like how minimum wage laws establish a minimum number of dollars that you have to pay your workers, you are certainly free to pay your workers more than minimum wage. Same thing here. This is a minimum percentage of deposits that banks must have on hand. They can have more if they want to. Okay? And so let's do an example. So let's say that you have $1,000 in deposits and the reserve requirement ratio is 25%. Then you have to have $250 on hand at the end of the day, which means you can loan $750. Okay? And so, and if we lowered the reserve requirement ratio to, let's say, 10%, then you could loan an additional $150, which is saying that you could now loan up to $900, right? And you have to only have $100 on hand, okay? And so the idea, if we were to show this on our graph, right? If we lower the reserve requirement ratio, then that will actually increase the supply of money as banks are able to make more loans to people. Okay, so lowering is an increase in supply of money, and raising it would be a decrease in supply of money. Okay? So banks can the Federal Reserve can raise or lower the reserve requirement ratio as they need to in order to move the supply of money left and right. Okay? The second one is the discount rate. And the discount rate is excuse me, the rate at which banks can borrow, the interest rate, I should say. At which banks can borrow money from the Fed. Okay, so this is the interest rate at which banks can borrow money from the Fed. So if a bank does not meet its reserve requirements, it has to borrow the money. It has to meet them every single night. And it has two options. It can borrow money directly from other banks and say, hey, let's say we're at Bank of America, and Comerica calls us and says, hey, Bank of America, I'm $1,000 short on my deposits for tonight. Can I borrow some money from you so I can meet my reserve requirement ratio? And Bank of America, we being the nice people, will say, oh yeah, of course you can. We'll loan you the money overnight, but you're going to have to pay us interest on it, right? And so that would be one way that the banks can meet their reserve requirements, or banks can borrow money directly from the Fed instead. Okay, and typically banks will do whichever one is cheaper. So if we're offering a very high interest rate on our overnight loan, and the Fed is offering a lower interest rate on its overnight loan, then the banks will borrow from the Fed. Interestingly, a small caveat, the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate is the interest rate that banks borrow at from each other, right? So typically these two things move together. They don't have to, but they tend to move in lockstep. Okay, so the discount rate is the interest rate at which banks can borrow money from the Fed, and the Fed funds rate is the interest rate that banks borrow money from each other at. Okay, and just like before, the Fed can raise or lower the discount rate. Okay, so if we have our initial supply of money, and let's say that they lower the discount rate, well, that makes it cheaper for banks to borrow money, and so they increase their money supply. Okay, and so again, lowering causes an increase in the supply of money, and raising causes a decrease in the supply of money. Okay, and then the last one that we talked about and that we're going to talk about today are what are known as open market operations. Okay, and open market operations are simultaneously the easiest one to think about, but also the most confusing. Okay, and what this is it's a way for the Fed to directly inject money into banks. And the way they do this is they buy or sell bonds. Okay. So if the Fed buys bonds, okay, and what this means is that, let's say the banks are over here and the Federal Reserve is here. So if the Fed purchases this bond, right, if the Fed says, we want this bond, we're going to give you money, right, they trade money for the bond. Now there's more money over here, and there's less money over here. So if the Fed buys bonds, this increases the supply of money. And if the Fed sells bonds, this will decrease the supply of money. Okay. So if the Fed says, hey, give me money, I'll give you this bond, right, then there will be less money in the bank. Okay. Now, for the purposes of this class, right, and again, it's just a principles, survey type class, we're just going to say that if the Fed wants to buy bonds, it's going to buy bonds. The bank doesn't really have a choice but to sell them. Okay? And if the Fed wants to sell bonds, they're going to sell bonds. The bank doesn't have a choice but to purchase them. Okay? And so, again, this is only for this class. This is for the purposes of our class in this particular setting. Right? the banking system doesn't have a choice but to buy or sell the bonds. Okay, in reality, they do, but it complicates the analysis that we're going to do in a way that doesn't really add much understanding to the level of understanding that we want in this class. Okay, so here, if the Fed is buying bonds, they're just buying bonds, and that's the end of it. Okay.